Fitch High School, and I really thank you for being here this evening. My name is Joe Arcarice. I'm the principal here at the high school, and I'm very proud that you braved this weather to come out. We do have about 400 cots in case you can't get home. No, I'm just kidding. It should be okay. But thank you for coming out. I was really nervous that it wasn't going to be a big turnout, that people would stay away because of the weather. So thank you so very much. Before I introduce Betty Ann Reiter, I do have to tell you about the exits. By law, if there's 100 or more people in here, you have exits in the rear and on both sides. And if you have to, you can run on the stage and run out in the back. But there's plenty of exits in the back and on the sides, okay? So at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce Betty Ann Reiter, who is in charge of the Groton Library. She does an awful lot of great things in the community. She also works real well here with us at Fitch High School. So it's my pleasure to introduce Betty Ann Reiter.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. And we had calls all day today, I will tell you, about whether we were going to be canceling this event. And I guess I didn't realize that we had picked the perfect place. I forgot that this was a shelter, so it was perfect. And we're all set. Welcome to the final program of the 11th annual One Book, One Region program. As Joe said, my name is Betty Ann Reiter, and I feel like I'm a very lucky person because I have two great jobs, Director of the Groton Library and Chair of the One Book, One Region Committee. I know that some of our committee members are here, and I would ask them to stand because they work so hard all year helping us choose the book. And also, you'll be able to see them in the audience, and then you can ask them questions about how this all happened. So please, stand up. Looking out tonight, I know that some of you have been faithful One Book readers since Snow in August in 2002. Some of you may fade in and out, attracted by a particular title. Was it Kite Runner in 2004? Or maybe Mountains Beyond Mountains with Tracy Kidder in 2005. Over our 11-year history, thousands of residents have joined with neighbors, parents, children, and friends to read and discuss a good book, and in the process talked about tolerance, bullying, immigration, freedom of speech, healthcare in Haiti, civil liberties, literacy, the Holocaust, and the events of 9/11. A program like One Book relies on outstanding partners. We want to offer a special thank you to Fitch High School, especially Sean McKenna, Carol Kirchhoff, and Principal Joe Arcarice for their enthusiastic support of the project. Bank Square Books also deserves a very special mention for the knowledge, support, and contacts they share with us. This year, we are very pleased to welcome a new sponsor whose support has made this evening possible, Connecticut Humanities. The mission of Connecticut Humanities articulates their desire to create opportunities for Connecticut's residents to come together to learn from and about each other, to discuss issues of vital concern, to explore new ideas and historical perspectives, and to experience the cultural richness around them. We believe that this is just what we do each year as we spend some time coming together as a community to appreciate the importance of reading just one book. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Stuart Parnes, the Executive Director of Connecticut Humanities, who will introduce our special guest.
I'd like all the men to stand up. Come on, up. Up. And women, come on, applause. Thank you, Betty. So the first question probably is, who the heck is the Connecticut Humanities? We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We get a lot of support from the state of Connecticut and also from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we do what Betty has already suggested in reading some of our mission statement. We try to bring people together around important ideas and great things to read and discussions, ways to share our thoughts and our ideas with each other. And we think it's really important, which is why we love doing what we do here and with this One Book, One Region program, especially this year. Caleb's Crossing has kind of checked off all the boxes of the sorts of things that we love to try to do. It talks about how we can remember and connect with the various social and diverse cultural and ethnic groups around us. And they're still here. The Puritans are still here, and the Native Americans are still here. It talks about how we try to help our libraries and museums deal with contemporary issues, and over the years this series has certainly done that. And it helps our libraries and museums to bring audiences together, just the way you came here this evening. We try to reach out to the community and get more people involved in the work that we do. So we're thrilled to be partners this year, and I know we're going to continue to do it. Geraldine Brooks, I'm not going to do her biography because you probably have all checked that out already. But she is a citizen of the world, raised in Australia, beautiful Sydney, fabulous city, made her way over to this continent, but then she spent years in her first career as a journalist going to places that the rest of us would probably choose exactly not to go to. Places like Palestine and Yemen and Bosnia and Somalia. And then we're very grateful that she came to her senses and decided that what she really should be doing is writing fantastic historical novels. Her gift is that she can take a tiny piece of a real historical fact and turn it into something absolutely spectacular. So I think of her not so much as a world traveler as I do of a time traveler. She's taken us to 15th century Spain. She's taken us to 17th century Derbyshire and 17th century Massachusetts. She's taken us to Civil War Virginia. She's taken us to 20th century Sarajevo. And all these places become real in her writing. Her books, Brooks's books are hard to say that way. Her books are really spectacular, as I said, examples of what historical novels should be. Starting with a tiny piece of sort of an unknown factoid, she builds a vibrant world that's filled with tremendously rich, passionate, and real, believable characters, brilliant detail, and spectacular language. She opens up an imaginary world for us, and in so doing, I think she helps us come back to see our own world much more clearly. She does write beautifully, which really helps. Her books are of terrific pleasure for all of us, and not just those folks from the Pulitzer people, you know. So Mark Twain once said that the older I get, the more clearly I remember things that never happened. And I'd like to turn that around this evening, because the more of Geraldine Brooks's books that I've read, and I've read nearly all of them, the more I remember things and will remember things that never really happened. Please help me welcome Geraldine Brooks.
Mark Twain also said something that is a bit of a North Star for me. He said, fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. And when I was here back in May, kicking off the one read, I shared with you a story about watching an episode of Oprah Winfrey's program sort of under duress, because I was at the doctor's office and I really would have rather been reading something, but the doctor had just got really excited about his new flat screen TV, so it had to be on all the time. And those things are a menace, aren't they? Everywhere there's a flat surface, suddenly now there's a flat screen TV. Really bothers me on the boat to Martha's Vineyard when you're going through one of the most beautiful waterways on earth, and there's those Fox News bloviators going on and on. Anyway, it was about a woman who was sports fishing with her boyfriend, and she was videotaping while he fought this magnificent fish that was on his line, and the fish is breaching in the sunlight, and she's oohing and ahhing about his magnificent fishermanly prowess. And I'm really barracking for the fish. But then all of a sudden the fish flips in midair, and suddenly it's coming straight for the boat. And suddenly the videotape that the woman is holding goes all blurry, and there's a terrible scream because the swordfish's sword has speared her through the chest. But she didn't die because the gooey contents of her silicone breast implant diverted the sword and pushed it away from her vital organs. And so she's there holding up her x-ray, and I'm there going, you could not make that up. Fiction must be plausible. But I realized that day that was a little bit of an epiphany, and I'm sitting there, and piff, I suddenly understood that that's exactly what I look for in the ideas for my novels, is the truth that is too remarkable to be plausible, but it happened. So Caleb's Crossing exists because, and people find it interesting to read, I think, because Caleb actually graduated from Harvard in 1665, a young man raised in his own Wampanoag culture and cosmology. If I'd made that up, everybody would have said, "Oh, get out of here." That could never have happened. So you never know where you're going to find an idea for a novel. Hemingway had a great line. He said, an idea for a novel can be something that you're lucky enough to overhear, or the wreck of your whole damn life. I get a lot of good ideas in graveyards. I don't think it's necessary to be a necrophiliac to write historical fiction, but it helps. It helps if you love the dead. And I do love the dead. I love to commune with them. Certain people have priorities for traveling, but the cathedrals or the art museums, the great restaurants, for my husband and me, it's always been graveyards. In fact, I was walking in the graveyard near my house just this morning, because when it's as blustery as this, it's no fun to walk the dogs on the beach. And the graveyard is a really good place, and I've taught them not to be disrespectful, which is hard for them to understand, but they're there now. But you get some great ideas there, some inspirations. Actually, it was in one of the cemeteries on Martha's Vineyard that I got the inspiration when I was still a summer person, just coming for a couple of weeks and renting a shack on the island. And we'd often talked about living there year-round, but it didn't seem like we were ever going to actually get to do it. And then one day I looked down at this gravestone, and it was a fairly recent gravestone. And under the name and the dates of this gentleman was an inscription that said, "At last, a year-round resident." So, yes, many good ideas come out of graveyards. The idea for Caleb's Crossing came out of a map that the Wampanoag people had prepared, and when I saw that notation, 1665, I couldn't read it because my mind wasn't willing to accept that there could have been a Native American in that white male waspy bastion of super privilege before 1965. And so it took me a while to realize that 1665 was not a misprint. And indeed, you know, Harvard's foundational documents, its charter, states that the university was founded in 1636 for the education of English and Indian youth of this country. And so there it was right from the beginning, and that mission somehow was lost and buried for a long time, to the extent that people at Harvard didn't even know where the Indian College had stood until an archaeological investigation finally unearthed the foundations 2 years ago. So it was exactly what I love to search for when I'm writing a novel, is a rich piece of history, an implausible fact of history, a part of history where you can know something, but you can't know too much. My late departed Martha's Vineyard neighbor, William Styron, put it beautifully. He said, the historical novelist works best when fed on short rations. Because if there's too much known, if there are too many journals, if there are too many letters, too many facts, then it's a job for a narrative historian. There's not enough room for imagination to work. So I'm always looking for voids in the record. And I pretty soon learned that the voids in the case of Caleb were extensive. So little is known of this remarkable young man, beyond the bare facts of his birthplace and the fact that he was a remarkable student and the first Native American graduate, but of what it was like to be him, of how he came to make that crossing between these two worlds and to sit down and be educated with the sons of the colonial Puritan elite. All of those details are lost to us. So I had plenty of room to maneuver. But I think most of you have probably read the book, so I'm not going to dwell too much on Caleb right now in these remarks because we'll have Q&A later, and if you have any burning questions, I'll be happy to answer them then. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to be a historical novelist and what it's like and how I try and go about doing it. And I think that I got a little bit of insight into my own process in a very unlikely place. I went to a math lecture. I hadn't been to a math lecture since I was 15 years old. The earliest opportunity to jettison mathematics from my school life, I took it. And I'm not proud of that. But I felt very much that this was not my thing. And so when they let you drop math, I dropped it. But a few years ago, on a crisp autumn day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I found myself obliged, for reasons that I won't go into, to attend a pretty high-powered lecture called Singularities in Algebraic Plane Curves. Now, I sort of slumped into the room, dragging myself unwillingly with a doodle pad in my hand. And I thought if I could find a nice pillar to position myself behind, a discreet nap might even be possible. But on the pad that I carried that day, there are some doodles, but there are also fragments of sentences from the mathematician's lecture. And I'll read you a couple of them. A formal power series about the origin is an infinite sum. Homomorphism is an isomorphism if and only if the matrix is invertible. I started leaning forward. This is poetry, I said to myself. And because I started listening, something very extraordinary happened. This mathematician was eloquent. She was passionate. She was in love with her subject. And the minute I let go of the notion that I couldn't possibly understand a word she was saying, something really extraordinary happened. And it was as if she had opened a really heavy door just a crack, and a ray of light came in. And it wasn't that I understood her work, but I understood her thought processes. And I realized then that I could see a little glimpse of the world in which she lived. And when she looked at the old maple tree beyond the lecture room window, at the big swoop of its bough arcing out from its massive trunk, her consciousness overlaid a pattern on that branch that was elegant and sensual. I could imagine for a moment what it was like to see with her eyes, to feel with her heart, to inhabit a space in which the language was not particular and national, but infinite and universal. A world in which every object sang to her with its own particular music. And I know now that it's a beautiful world. I'm grateful to her for that insight. But I also know that I still can't live there. Because if she has lungs, I have gills. Words are my medium. They flow through me and around me, and some delicate hidden membrane that I have grasps onto what's in them, and it gives me the necessary substance for my life's work. But I am sure that our work, the mathematicians and mine, are essentially the same work. In her exploration of the singularity in every plane curve, she seeks a way to more perfectly describe this world, to describe that arcing branch or a soaring bridge or the squiggle in a squirrel's upraised tail. She pushes her way deeper and deeper into the full truth of the world, and that also is what I have to try to do. So it's lucky for me that my tools, that the words that I use for this are English words, because that means that I live in a very old nation of open borders, a rich and deep and multi-layered, promiscuous universe infused with Latin and German and French and Greek and Arabic and countless other tongues. I wouldn't be able to swim so far or dive so deep in a linguistically isolated language such as Hungarian, or even a protectively elitist and nationalistic one such as French. It's the openness of English that gives it the richness and depth. So when you say a word in English, just take a simple one like chief. I've unwittingly ushered a querulous horde into the room. A Roman legionary is there, shaking his cap or head. And Andy Capp is there, slouching in his signature working man's headgear. The toque-wearing cook is there too, reminding me that English had chef from the French, who'd changed the Romans' k sound to a sh and the p sound to an f, before it had captain from the Latin, which is why the word chief now sounds more like the younger word than its older word. So the English root of chief, is it really, should it be properly described as French, from which English first borrowed it, or Latin, from which it originated? I don't really care. That's a job for a lexicographer to work out, or a linguistics expert. But as a novelist, I'm really glad to have this immense cast of captains and chefs and legionaries standing behind my chief, telling me that whoever she is in my novel, she's trailing this vast raft of history and association behind her and subtly framing her in my readers' minds even before I get to let her utter a single word. So language is really important to me in the book. I think it's another Twainism. The difference between the right word and the wrong word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. So I go to a lot of trouble to get the language right. And if you're writing from a past time, it's essential in shaping your character and in pulling your reader into the world that you're trying to create and make plausible. It's essential to get a sense of the authentic language. And sometimes I say a sense of it advisedly. My first book, the narrator was a Derbyshire dialect-speaking shepherdess and lead miner's widow, and if I'd written the whole book in archaic Derbyshire dialect, nobody would have read it. So I used those Derbyshire dialect words as a seasoning to give a sense of authenticity. But the hunting down of the right word is crucial. A novelist friend of mine called Jim Crace told me a story once that really encapsulated the importance of this. He was writing a novel called Quarantine that's set in biblical Israel. And to do some research, he decided to go camping in the Judean desert with a Bedouin guide. And the first morning of this camping trip, the guide awakened him with a beautiful cup of cardamom-scented coffee and said, "Mr. Jim, how did you sleep?" And he said, "Ahmed, I slept like a log." And then he raised his eyes to the bare, rock-ribbed hillsides of the Judean desert. No logs. So he turned to his guide and he said, Ahmed, how did you sleep? And Ahmed said, Mr. Jim, I slept like a dead donkey. So Jim Crace said that the art of writing convincing fiction is changing logs into dead donkeys. And when you read Caleb, I hope you'll find a number of dead donkeys in there. But how do you do it? How do you get the right words? Well, the first thing you have to do is read everything you can find that was written in that time and place until the cadences of the speech and the kind of vocabulary starts to resonate in your head. And then you find yourself being a ridiculous person to live with. My boys were playing lacrosse in the house. And I have a rule. I think it is a very fair rule that you do not play lacrosse in the house. But they were doing it, and I heard myself yelling out to them, "You are vexing me with your ungirt behaviors." This happens to me with every book. With Year of Wonders, it was the abuse that sort of stuck in my head. So whenever I get cut off in traffic, even to this day, I will still hit down the window and yell out, "A pox on you, you rake-shamed fanfaroon!" And it is so much more satisfying than just giving the guy the bird, you know? And it's a bit safer, too, because by the time he figures out you insulted him, you're long gone. So we've had 3 Twain quotes already. I think I'm going to move along to Henry David Thoreau, my second favorite quote machine. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "The youth gets together his materials to build a bridge to the moon, or perchance a palace or a temple on the earth. And at length, the middle-aged man concludes to build a woodshed with them." Well, it didn't go that way for me. I started out longing for the woodshed. I was aiming for a nice, tight, serviceable structure that would serve a modestly useful purpose. My ambition was to be a newspaper reporter in the city of my birth. I would try to write stories that helped people. Perhaps every so often, an article might right a local wrong or even shift policy a few degrees in a more progressive direction. But generally, my stories would be useful simply by offering an informative and entertaining read, and then they'd end up lining the floor of the parrot cage. But in my 20s, unexpected doors opened for me, and my ambition enlarged a bit. I got a scholarship to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and from there I got hired by the Wall Street Journal, and then by a very, very strange turn of events. Well, I might just digress and tell you this. I was working in Cleveland for the Wall Street Journal, which I consider my first foreign assignment. And then my dad got sick back in Sydney, so I had to go home. So they asked me to open an Australasian bureau, and they'd never had one before. So in many ways, that's the job you want, because nobody has any idea what you might be good for. And I used it to be a foreign correspondent at home, to range all over the place, writing stories about things that interested me, like delivering supplies to remote Aboriginal communities through the crocodile-infested waters of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Some of you might have seen Crocodile Dundee. You probably thought it was a broad comedy documentary film. I'd just been over to New Zealand, and I'd written a story about global warming research, and this was back in the 80s, so it was early days, but there was some very advanced research happening in New Zealand on methane gas, which is a major greenhouse gas, and New Zealand has 2 amazing things going for it, one of which is the cleanest air in the world. That air that blows up around the southern end of the island is so clean that they actually bottle it and send it to San Diego to be analyzed, to the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And they have a lot of trouble because people just see these empty bottles being shipped at great expense. But they also have a remarkably large population of sheep. And sheep are large producers of methane. And so I had spent a very pleasant couple of days following climate scientists as they ran up verdant hillsides trying to get methane samples from sheep. And I'll just let you think on that. So it was one of the stories that the old Lion Wall Street Journal used to love to do, and it ran on the front page. And I'm sitting at home in Sydney, and I'm feeling pretty good about that. And the phone rings, and it's the foreign editor. This is not good. She has never called me on any story I've ever written from Sydney, not on her priority list. So I pick up the phone with trepidation, thinking I am going to get the sack for putting too many tasteless farting sheep jokes in the Wall Street Journal. But she was actually calling to offer me the job as Middle East correspondent for the paper. Farting sheep, Middle East crises. Don't ask me. Anyway, I went. And as a foreign correspondent, I started to think that building a temple might not be out of the question. I was bearing witness in the dark and troubled places of the earth, and I began to entertain a hope that my words might have an impact on the councils of the powerful, or I hoped at least that they'd be a true and valuable reflection of the history that was unfolding before my eyes, that first rough draft that historians and analysts would turn to as they shaped a better understanding of our times. And then I got thrown in the slammer by the Nigerian secret police, and I didn't know how long they were going to keep me. And I started to think as I'm lying on the concrete floor of an unlovely lockup in Port Harcourt, which is a place I really, of all the places I've been, heartily counsel you not to put on your travel itinerary. I started to think about people like Terry Anderson, who'd been held for 8 years. And I thought, 8 years. If they hold me for 8 years, I will then be too old to get pregnant. And I had never thought about it. I was 39 years old, and you think it might have crossed my mind, but it hadn't. So when they deported me, luckily, after only 3 days of incarceration, I went home and I greeted my husband with more than usual enthusiasm. And our son was born the following year, and that's when my thoughts turned to not wanting to go on long open-ended assignments to places where they might throw you in the slammer, because to me it wasn't compatible with being the kind of mum that I wanted to be. So what was I going to do? Well, this story had been banging around in my head about what happened when bubonic plague came to this village in the Peak District, and the villagers had taken the unique decision to quarantine themselves rather than flee and spread the infection. So that was your silicon breast swordfish kind of moment, a very unlikely decision, a community to come together and make this self-sacrificing choice, unique as far as I've been able to discover. And so I sat down and tried to write a few chapters of that, and I sent it off to my agent who had represented my 2 nonfiction books. And I didn't hear from her, so I thought, oh, she hated it and she's too tactful to say so. And so I started to think about, getting back into journalism, and then she called and told me she'd sold it. And then I had no choice but to write it. And that's when the Bridge to the Moon started to seem like it might be a possibility. So as a middle-aged person, I started on my real career, I guess, the career that I was meant to have. And like that mathematician, now I'm after nothing less than eternal truth. What is the world? And how can we more perfectly describe that sound in the back there, which is really very peculiar. But it's one thing to want to be able to describe the truth of something perfectly, and another thing, of course, to be able to do it. So I know that I have to do the best I can with the materials that I've got in my hands. And these are materials that I started amassing, I guess, from the time I became literate and started to love novels, but also in those years as a journalist. And there's some very, very important tools that I acquired, and I'll just tell you about a couple of them. When I decided that I wanted to be a journalist, I was heading off to the University of Sydney, and I'm thinking, well, what should I study? What would be desirable? What will make me irresistible to the newspaper? So they'll have to hire me. So I read the paper assiduously, and I thought there's a lot of politics in here, but there's also a lot of cultural coverage. So I did a combined degree in government and fine arts, thinking that I covered the waterfront there. And 4 years later, I emerged tremendously well-informed on the uses of tempera in Quattrocento painting and classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes. And so they sent me to the sports department to cover the races. Farthing sheet, Middle East crises, tempera, races. Actually, I didn't actually get to cover the races in any meaningful sense, if that conjures an idea of writing color pieces about characters at the track like Damon Runyon might have done or something. But my job was to amass and record the details that the real racing riders needed, like the weights the horse were carrying, their handicaps, where they were at the turn, where they were at the finish, what the odds started at, what they went out to, the condition of the track, all kinds of BS and stuff that I don't now remember, but you had to do it for every horse in every race, at every race meeting in Sydney. And my goodness, they have a lot of race meetings in Sydney. So I was running around amassing these details, and then I had to go back to the newspaper after the race day had concluded and check the first edition before the presses rolled on it to make sure there wasn't an error, because unbelievably, in the age we're living in now, rural bookmakers still paid out on the results in the first edition of the newspaper. So if I made a mistake, I would be terminated. And I don't mean just losing my job. So it gave me a great respect for facts. And that is incredibly useful to a novelist. And you might say, why isn't fiction the antithesis of fact? But not really. Facts are the scaffolding. That's the thing that allows me to persuade you, again, of the truth of the world that I'm trying to make you believe in. So the better my collection of the facts, the more meticulously I can assemble the scaffolding, the more outrageous the structure I can set upon it and still bring you along for the ride. So that was useful. I'm feeling a little pressure to move it along here. So those tools get a good workout. The other thing, the most important thing probably is that a journalist can't have writer's block. And so if you don't file, you fail. The mot juste en arriving is not going to impress your desk. I remember once I was sitting in the newspaper office in Sydney writing my deathless prose about a dreadful mine catastrophe that had happened, and, you know, really pouring my heart out into this piece, and the crusty old, I mean, this guy was beyond crusty. This guy was a day-old baguette. He's standing behind me, and he's saying, "Where's the copy?" No, where's the something, something, something copy? And I'm saying, I just can't figure out how to end it. And he said, "End it? End it? I'll end it." And he leaned over my shoulder and hit E-N-D and pulled it out of it. And that was my wonderful story. But so I don't believe in writer's block, and I'm not allowed to have it any more than a hairdresser has hairdresser's block, or an auto electrician has auto electrician's block. You get up every day and you go to work. And I live in a place with a lot of beautiful old stone walls, and I think it's very much like building a stone wall, except the words are the stones, and you have to fit them into place perfectly, and it takes a lot of effort, and you scrape your hands to pieces, and sometimes the wall goes up and the pieces fit beautifully, and other times that stone just won't fit, and you get frustrated and you cram it in anyway, and the effect is unsightly, and the balance is precarious, and when you come back the next day, you can't stand to look at it. So you have to bring in the backhoe and push the bastard over and start again. But that really is what it is. It is a craft before it can possibly be an art, and you have to work on it every day. And I just conclude, I'm going to just skip ahead here. Oh boy, I was really ambitious about how much I could. All right. One of the joys of having kids is you get to read children's literature again. And children's literature is fabulously instructive when you're trying to write adult literature, because unlike many adult novelists, children's novelists understand the essential importance of plot, that X must inexorably lead to Y. And if X is interesting, Y better be exponentially more interesting. And I would find I'm reading these wonderful books to my sons, and I've read them into a stupor. They're totally passed out, and I can't put the thing down. And then I, reluctantly set it aside and go off to read my own luminous, liminal literary novel. And I want to drop kick the thing across the room, because the authors are concerned with all kinds of other things before they are concerned about plot. And I guess I'm the kind of writer who thinks that plot is central, and reading to the kids helps with that. But recently we were reading not a novel to them, a really beautiful little classic of 1936, written by an Austrian art historian named Ernst Hans Gombrich, and it's called A Little History of the World. And in the introduction to this remarkable book, Gombrich describes the business of writing about the past, and I've never seen it put more beautifully, I think. It is, he says, like lighting a scrap of paper and dropping it into a bottomless well. As it falls and burns, it lights up the sides of the well in the same way that our memories light up the past. The deeper it falls, the less is illuminated. Living memory gives way to archives, archives to cave paintings to fossils, until the light goes out and everything is dark. But, as Gombrich writes, even in that dark silence, we've not yet reached the beginning of the human story. Behind every beginning, no matter how long ago, there's another beginning. Every generation has its once upon a time. Your grandmother, her grandmother, your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and already we're back several hundred years, and every one of them probably telling stories that started with some version of once upon a time. I'm very proud and grateful to be in that long tradition of storytellers. Thank you very much. And I know that nobody ever gets up to come to a microphone, so if you want to ask a question, I will endeavor to hear it and repeat it so everybody knows. So, anybody out there? Comments, rants, abuse, also welcome. Yes. Why did Makepeace treat his sister that way? I think that I have some ideas about why he treated his sister that way. I think he was a very frustrated young guy, and he had a destiny that he was meant to fulfill, to be an educated man and a minister. But in my mind, he was suffering from dyslexia, which of course nobody would have understood at that time. And they thought he was a dullard, but he wasn't a dullard, but he's trying to do something for which his brain isn't able to have the equipment and nobody could help him. So he's trapped on this treadmill of trying to be somebody that he can't be. And meanwhile, this brat of a sister doesn't even have to try, and she can just understand all these things and read all these different languages and learn them seemingly effortlessly to him. And so he's insanely jealous of her, and it seems really wrong to him and upside down. But also, he's a product of his time, and in his time it was not thought good for women to be too learned. A good Puritan woman should know how to read so she could read her Bible to her kids. But beyond that, her education was to stop, because it was really thought that the female brain could be addled by too much study, that she would be an unfit wife if she knew more than her husband. And writing was out. You know, when it came time to teach the kids to write, the girls would be sent to do embroidery or something, because writing is a skill that you need to communicate with people that are outside your own household, and no good Puritan wife should be doing that. And this idea persisted well into the 1700s, and that's why we have very few female journals before 1750, no good ones before 1750 at all, and hardly any. And even people like Benjamin Franklin's sister, who was probably just as brilliant as Benjamin Franklin was, could barely write a literate sentence because it wasn't thought fit to educate women even at that late date. So at this earlier date, the fact that Bethia is wanting this knowledge is considered very, very spiritually questionable by her brother. So he's angry with her on a number of levels. But when he is able to find his place in the world, he becomes a better person when he stops trying to be somebody that other people want him to be and can just be himself. Then their relationship is able to be repaired to some extent. Yeah.
Are you working on something now, and if so, what?
I wish I was working on something. I live on Martha's Vineyard, and in the summer, what I work on is running a B&B, basically. Every single person in our family has been. And they all arrive gung-ho for a vacation. So it's, you know, you've just seen off one crew and had a very nice time, and then the next crew arrive and the cocktail shakers are out at 11 o'clock, and the kids are all over the place with their schedules. So I just threw in the towel this August and said I'm not going to get anything done till after Labor Day. And here we are after Labor Day, and I still haven't managed to get anything done. But next week, man, I am going to glue my backside to my chair and stay in my study and work on it. And it appears to be shaping up into a book about King David's relationship with Nathan. And Nathan, those of you who paid attention in shul or Sunday school will know, is the guy who turns up occasionally and says, "King, you suck." And I just started wondering what was the career path for that guy. Yeah, this is about the when Bethia's trying to instruct Caleb about the story of Genesis and the Garden of Eden, and he's not buying it. And the question is, isn't this a little bit tongue-in-cheek on his part? It may have been. It's from the historical record. I took that wholesale from a journal by a young minister called John Cotton, who was sent to Martha's Vineyard as a sort of a penance after he'd been caught stooping one of his parishioners. And so he has to go out and work as a minister on the island. And he kept remarkable notes, which is fabulous. And he writes down all the questions that the Wampanoag asked him. And it is possible that this Wampanoag was sending him up, but I don't think so. I actually think that because of the similarity of the creation stories of the Wampanoag about the spirit, the great father Kaitan, giving corn and beans to the people, they were saying, well, why would you give it and not expect them to eat it? I don't think on the face of it it made sense to them. But my favorite bit is what he says next, which was, and even if this unlikely story is true, Why original sin? Why would God be angry with me about it, who just heard of it this very day? And that is an actual exchange between a Wampanoag man and John Cotton, which I lifted wholesale and gave to Caleb. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had any kind of Wampanoag, not fact checkers, but did you have some folks from the Wampanoag tribe kind of going over?
Yes, I did. I had some very kind early readers who set me straight on one or two things, and then some people who I wanted to read the book wouldn't, because they just thought the whole enterprise was a bad idea. They thought you shouldn't fictionalize the life of somebody who lived, and that we can't know the truth of. And then, so when the book came out, they had one or two points to make that would have been nice if they'd made them earlier. So I made a couple of changes in the paperback to accommodate that. It's obviously a cultural minefield. I was aware of that stepping into it, but I do have a core belief that while it is essential to avoid appropriating Native American story, I think because it is at this point our shared story, to tell it from Bethia's point of view seemed a worthwhile exercise to me. I think any attempt to empathize and put yourself in somebody else's shoes, no matter how flawed, can never be contemptible, because I think we all need to do a lot more of that all the time. So most of the people in the tribe are accepting, and some are enthusiastic about the book, and one or two are still mad as hornets. Yeah.
Who are some authors you enjoy reading?
Oh, so many different ones. I guess my favorite living author would be Marilyn Robinson. I think Gilead is as close to a perfect novel as I've ever read. My favorite no longer with us author, probably Jane Austen. I also love a British writer called Mary Renault, because she does what I try to do in historical fiction, which is take you into a very different time and place. The question is, was I told as a young girl that I could do anything? Or was I told that there were constraints? And I think there were two messages. The society I grew up in was quite conservative. So it was very unusual in my little corner of lower middle class Sydney for girls to go to college. Very unusual at that time. And everything changed in the next decade or so. The entire country changed. But so that was coming from the outside. But from the inside of our house, my mother was relentless in her view that her daughters could do anything. And she was tremendously supportive. She was very strict and very protective until we hit our majority, and then it was go, do it. You're going to raft across the Tigris River with a bunch of Kurdish guerrillas. How wonderful, darling. Yeah.
Are you aware that you have all these incredibly strong female characters in your books? It seems like all your books have these great, really driven, independent women. Is that by design, or?
I guess it just happens that all my books have women I like to spend time with. And I wouldn't want to spend time with some wimpy wallflower. So, but a lot of it is to do with growth and change. And the first novel is very much a woman who starts out wimpy and retiring, and then she finds her inner strength, and catastrophe changes her. And I think that is feeding off the experiences that I had as a foreign correspondent, seeing women in the most constricting social milieus, women who were brought up in places where they have this terrible old proverb that says, the good woman leaves her house only twice, once to be married and once to be buried. And then a catastrophe comes and there are no men, and she's got to lead her family to safety over a mined mountain pass, or she's got to, God forbid, take up arms to defend them, or do some remarkable thing that she would never in a million years have thought that she'd be called on to do. And I met women who'd made these journeys time and again, and so that emboldens me to let my women who are from societies in the past that were very restrictive, but there are always women who kick the doors down. And you see them, you can find them on the court records. They're always being hauled into court and being criticized by the religious or by the magistrates. One of my favorite charges is caught and accused of being a scold. And a scold meant that you'd been overheard criticizing a man in public. And it's a jolly good thing that one's not on the books any longer. Yeah. Question is, how much of yourself ends up in your writing? And is it a conscious using of your own experience? Not a lot of conscious biographical using, I think, but I do feed on what I learned as a foreign correspondent. And I don't think I could write these books if I hadn't had all those years of experience of seeing people in the most dire situations and being always perplexed by how catastrophe will lead some people to find their best self and some their worst. And you never know, I think, until it befalls you what it's going to be. Are you going to be the hero or the coward? Are you going to be the kind person, or are you going to become the brutal torturer? And that question and those paradoxes really perplexed me as a reporter, and I think I'm still chewing on that in my writing a lot. So to that extent, it comes from my experience, but not a tremendous amount from other places. But maybe I need to lie on the couch and look a little bit deeper. So thank you all very, very much indeed.